Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. Tim Baker's my name, and obviously I'll be working with you throughout the course of this program, and which will go for a couple of months. And what you'll find is the way it's structured is that there'll be one session every 2 weeks. And the reason for that, of course, is that 2 weeks is about the ideal time. If it was every week, it'd be a bit overwhelming. And 3 or 4 weeks, you may well forget what we were talking about initially. So that's the process. I'll do a few housekeeping things at the beginning just to acquaint you with the program if this is your first time in a Lunch and Learn series. And very shortly, I'll share my screen and we'll get stuck into topic one. So we're talking about conversations, and conversations are critically important and often underrated when it comes to leadership and getting the best out of people. So we're going to really look at this topic in great detail. There's a little bit of homework I'll give you after each session, and it won't be homework where you're required to write something down. It'll be homework where you're required to do something different, try some things, and obviously it's got very much to do with conversations as such. Now, at any time you've got questions or comments that you'd like to make, go to the chat box and just type them in there, and don't be shy about that, because by doing that, I'll respond to them immediately. I won't be sort of leaving 15 minutes at the end to give you that opportunity. As soon as you think of something, just go straight to the chat box and away you go. So let's get underway. I'll just share my slides and then we can launch into topic one. Okay, so you can see hopefully my slides there in front of you, and we're looking at topic one, which of course is the authentic leader and being an authentic leader, and what does that actually mean. So we'll cover that in a bit more, obviously a lot more detail shortly, but what I wanted to do, give you a quick rundown of the program as such. Now, you'll notice in Unit 2, we're looking at the 5 conversations framework. Now, what I'm looking at there in particular is a framework that's being, I'm proud to say, used all over the world from one of my earlier books, The End of the Performance Review. And people are using it as an opportunity for check-ins. And one of the key themes that I'll be running through in this session is the need to have regular check-ins with your direct reports. Now, these don't have to be long meetings. I'm talking about 20 minutes each, and it probably, once a fortnight or once every 3 weeks is fine. But they are important because it enriches your working relationship with your direct reports. And it also, these conversations are very much developmental conversations. In Unit 3, we'll look at the coaching conversation. Now, of course, you at many times have to coach people, and I'm going to use the GROW model, which I find personally is one of my favorite models to use when you're coaching people. I'll run through that process with you. I'll actually even give you a coaching session as I run through it. As difficult as that will be, but it won't be one where I'm doing it one-on-one, but I'll be asking you a series of questions, asking you to write down your comments and looking to see whether or not I've had any impact in terms of whatever the issue is that you're going to be coached on. And you're not even going to share that with me, I might say. In topic 4, we'll look at the visioning conversation, because I think often people can't necessarily connect the dots between what they're doing right now and the end result. And so what that means is that people often can't see the forest for the trees, if you like. So it's important to have these purpose conversations with people, and there's a way of doing that. And I want to talk a little bit about that as a specific type of conversation. In topic 5, I want to talk about encouraging conversations to build commitment. People need encouragement. And I think the old school thought is that if we encourage people, they'll go soft. Well, there's nothing further from the truth. That's not necessarily the case. And it never was. In fact, when you encourage people, they often don't want to disappoint you in the future and always live up to your expectations as such. And the final unit that we'll look at Unit 6 is relationship building conversations in 5 easy steps. Some of the key things that you need to think about in relation to having conversations with people and what you need to do. So I hope you enjoyed the program. I'm sure you will. We've had great feedback in the past. And at any time, if you want to share your progress with me, you can send me an email and just let me know how it's all going. Or if you're having a bit of a stumbling block or whatever, you might want to just reach out to me, and you're more than welcome to do that. In fact, I'd encourage it. All right, so we're ready to get up and running. So let's get underway, and let's start with topic number one. So 3 things I want to cover in the short time we've got together up till 3 o'clock Brisbane time. I want to actually look at why conversations are important. We need to start the program with that. I'm sure you're aware of why they're important. You wouldn't actually have registered for the program otherwise. But I just want to talk about some broader issues around why they are important and what you can do about that. I also want to share with you during this session some barriers around having good conversations. And as I go through these 9 barriers with you, I want you to think about which of these barriers are actually getting in the way of you having really good conversations. What are the barriers that are actually sort of stopping you from improving the quality of your dialogue with the people that you actually work with? And the final thing I want to do is talk about the 5 pillars of authentic conversation. So what are these 5 pillars? How do we actually come across as more authentic? It's not a technique necessarily, as you could probably imagine. Being authentic is not a technique. It's really a state of mind and bringing your full self to work with you. And in the conversation context, it's being completely in the moment, in the conversation. So we'll cover those things off, and we're done for today. And then I'll set you some homework, and we'll catch up in a fortnight. Now, important thing, you will get a copy of the slides and the recording sometime either today or even Monday, but you'll get a copy. So at any time, you perhaps may not be able to make the Lunch and Learn series, you've got a meeting on or something, don't panic. The whole idea is that you will have a copy of the slides and the recording. Now, that's not an excuse not to turn up. It's always best to turn up live. The reason for that, of course, is that it's sort of like a commitment that you're making, 6 commitments over a couple of months. But nevertheless, you still register for all of them when I send out that email. So the next email you get from me will have the link to Unit 2. It won't have the link for all the others. It'll just have for Unit 2. Just register for that, whether you're going to be there or not. And of course, if you can't be there, you'll get a copy of the slides and the recording. All right, so that's where we're going. So let's get underway. Let me talk a little bit about conversations from my own experience, and just make a few observations about conversations that I think are important before we actually launch into some of the barriers. Now, one of the statements that I made in a book I wrote called Conversations at Work, which I co-authored with Aubrey Warren, and you can see behind me one of those books. In this book, we wrote down that, we made the point that organizations are conversations. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, organizations are made up of lots and lots of conversations that go on day to day. Some of them are task focused. Some of them are developmental focused. Some of them are short. Some of them are long. Some of them are boring. Some of them are interesting. Some of them go on forever. Some of them take 2 seconds. They go on in the boardroom. They go on in the lunchroom. They might even go on in the bathroom. These conversations go on everywhere. So one of the ways of thinking about an organization that's filled with human beings is a series of conversations. So if that's the case, then the question must be, how do we improve the quality of those conversations? Because arguably, if we can do that, we're going to improve lots of things. So really, organizations are actually a series of conversations. And as a leader, this is your main tool of trade when it comes to getting the best from the people that you lead. Now, a lot of good quality conversations, a lot of people would say are sadly lacking. I mean, it's quite interesting, isn't it, that if you had an opportunity if your parents were still alive, or you had an opportunity to call your parents this evening and you said, guess what, Mum and Dad, I'm doing a Lunch and Learn series on conversations. I'm having some training on conversations. People, your parents would probably have a bit of a chuckle at that. It's so interesting that we've sort of removed ourselves so much from having conversations with people that we need to be trained to do it, which I think is always quite amusing. But nevertheless, there's no question that they're just as important as they ever were. Trouble is, of course, is what we do is we're using technology to substitute for good old one-on-one conversations. And I think this is partly the problem with that. Lots of people tell me that there's an art form to having conversations, and that, you know, if you believe that it's an art form to have conversations, then it's likely that you're probably going to shirk the issue and think, oh, well, why bother? You know, I'm no good at this, because it's obviously something that you need some sort of great skill set to have. But let's face it, you and I have conversations every day. We have conversations non-stop. We are very, very well practiced at having conversations. So the vast majority of conversations we have are not an art form. It's pretty straightforward, really. I mean, I will admit to you that the difficult conversations do require some degree of skill, no question. And of course, we'll cover those in the Lunch and Learn series. But let's face it, a lot of the conversations we have are conversations that do not require, you would not classify them as an art form. So let's just demystify that and say that it's just something else that I need to learn to do better in my leadership, in my approach to leadership. And it does beg the question, though, have we lost the need for conversations? You know, because let's face it, we have a lot of conversations via email, we have a lot of conversations via text. But does that mean that we've lost the need for the good old-fashioned conversation? I think not. I think the good old-fashioned conversation is still as important as it ever was before. In fact, I could actually think it'd probably be even more important. And so I don't think conversations are going away in a big rush. I think they're becoming more and more important. And I think I'll explain that a bit further as we go through the Lunch and Learn series. I was talking with somebody the other day about their business, and this person who owned a business had a turnover of about 25% every year. In other words, 25 out of 100 people left the business every year. Obviously, they took their knowledge with them and went and worked somewhere else. Now, and of course, he called me in to say, look, can you help me? Because I want to try and arrest this massive staff turnover. And I asked him about the type of conversations that went on in the organization. And he told me that, he said, look, I know about your work. I think it's wonderful. I think the 5 conversations is great and all the rest of it. But he said, Tim, we don't have time for conversations. And of course, I was a bit dumbfounded by that statement. I said, what do you mean? You mean you don't have any conversations? He said, oh, no, we have, you know, task-related conversations. But in other words, he was implying that performance and developmental conversations were a waste of time, or certainly not a high priority. And of course, therein lies the problem, because people weren't connecting with their team leader. There was no sort of connection. So anyway, it was an interesting comment. Now, 2 colleagues of mine in the United States, James Kuzner and Barry Posner, wrote a wonderful book called Credibility. And in that book, I think it's in the very first chapter, they say this, they write this wonderful phrase. They said, leadership is a relationship. So have a think about that. Leadership is a relationship. Now, it's obviously not a personal relationship, or it shouldn't be, but nevertheless, it is a relationship, a working relationship nonetheless. Now, the question, it does beg the question, doesn't it? How do you have a relationship with anybody? And, you know, the answer to that is one conversation at a time. There is no other way. And so what that means is that if you are trying to get the very best from the people that you lead, which of course I'm sure you are, then you have no choice but to have regular conversations with these people, and to do it in a way that is meaningful and useful to yourself and of course to the other person. So hopefully this program will give you an opportunity to really consider that at a deeper level. So I just wanted to set the scene and just give you a few of my thoughts about the world of conversations and where it's going and some of the issues around it. But I realise, of course, I'm preaching to the converted here because I understand you're doing the program because you understand the value of it, albeit you might need a little bit of a hand or helping hand in terms of being able to improve the quality of your conversations. So I think I mentioned earlier, but I think if you think about it in the workplace, you've got two types of conversations broadly. So you've got task-related conversations or task-focused conversations, which are conversations about how we get the product or the service out the door, project-based conversations. Now, of course, they're not in short supply because the reality is we have to have those conversations in order to make sure that we get the product and the service out the door. So yes, they do occur. But we also have, or should have, another type of conversation in the workplace, which I refer to as people-focused. Now, people-focused conversations are, if we just talk about that specifically for a moment, are around performance and developmental conversations. Now, my judgment is that probably, and I work across 21 industries, but my judgment is that most organisations would spend 80% of their time having task-focused conversations and 20% of their time having people-focused conversations. Now, I don't discount the need to have task conversations, but I think what I would believe is that if we could bump up more of the people-focused conversations, we would need to have less of the task-focused conversations, because obviously misunderstandings, assumptions that are made, distrust, all of these issues come into play. And of course, some conversations are a combination of both task and people. But from my experience, it's rare to have both of those things in the one conversation. It's usually one or the other. So I'm going to encourage you to have regular check-ins with your team members if you don't already do so, because that's your opportunity to have what we might call people-focused conversations. All right, so just a bit, so really this program is basically very much focused on the people-focused conversations, because I'm not an expert clearly in what you do, nor should I be. You're the expert in that, but I'm the expert in the people-focused conversations, and that's what we'll concentrate on during the Lunch and Learn series. Now, I think at this point, I probably should give you some sobering statistics to think about. And it's a little bit wordy, this slide, so I'll just sort of paraphrase some of it, but I want you to have a think about this. And many of these stats, well, all of these stats come from reputable research. And one of the stats that I want to share with you is that 79% of people worldwide struggle with engaging and retaining their employees. You've probably seen these surveys that show that 70% of people are disengaged in their work, which is staggering, which basically means only 30% of people are actually engaged. That's a problem. And I believe that it's a problem because there isn't necessarily a good, solid foundation of a working relationship, often between the leader and the team member, and I want to help you with that. Another interesting statistic, and this is very disturbing, is 86% of organisations don't believe that they have the leadership pipeline to deal with these problems. In other words, leadership capacity is in short supply. People believe they just don't have, there aren't a lot of good leaders around that can do some of the things that I'm suggesting. And I want you to be one of those people. I want you to take this one on board with you. Thirdly, 90% of leaders rely on their own ideas rather than seeking out their involvement of the team members. Now, this comes back to the old concept of a hero leadership. Now, really, why not utilize the thoughts and ideas and thinking and perspectives of your team members? Now, not every decision, obviously, is around consultation. Now, if you started doing that, you'd end up being criticized for not being able to make a decision. But I think there's a lot of decisions that can be made with team input that aren't being made. For example, in your team meetings, what percentage of time goes into discussion and what percentage of time goes into reporting? Now, if you're like a lot of leaders, it's probably true to suggest that, again, it might be the 80-20, that if that, 90% of your meetings are around reporting and then maybe 10% on discussion and collaboration. And I would urge you to think about your team meetings as a vehicle to improve the quality of the decision making by involving people in more of the discussion around decision making in the future. Now, remember, there's two ways you can consult your team members. One of them is to consult, which means that you listen to what they have to say, but you don't necessarily take the advice. And the other is to collaborate. That is where you listen to your team members and ultimately, collectively, you make a decision. So both of those are open to you. And it clearly is a problem with 90% of people don't do that. Disturbingly, only 5% of people are effective at building trust. Now, if you think about it, the only way you and I can build trust is by connection. And ultimately, if we don't connect with our team members, we're not going to build any trust. Though people don't care how much you know until they know you care. Ultimately, it's about really relating to other people. 60% of people feel that their self-esteem was dented by their leader at work in some way. And so obviously, majority of people don't believe their leader has the necessary skill set to be able to boost self-esteem, which is ultimately part of what a leader's job is, not to dent it, but to boost it. 79% of people have quit work in exit interviews because of a lack of appreciation. Broadly, because of a lack of appreciation, they have quit their job and gone and work somewhere else. So the old adage that people don't leave organizations, they leave managers, I think is absolutely true. But it's only during these exit interviews that before the last time before somebody leaves, when they sort of confide in HR what actually was the real reason for leaving, it's often at that time that it becomes a lack of appreciation. 65% of North Americans report they didn't get enough recognition in the previous year, didn't get any recognition in the previous year. Now, that's disturbing. And as you could probably work out, one of the conversations we're going to be talking about is the encouraging conversation. That's one of the reasons I've got it on the list, because I don't think managers do anywhere near enough of this. And it doesn't require hours and hours of sitting down. A simple thank you occasionally doesn't go astray. It can be done as simply as that. But unfortunately, we don't do that. So let's look at 9 barriers that can get in the way of you having good conversations with your people. And as I go through these, I want you to think about which of these barriers might be getting in the way of you having good conversations with your people, and perhaps what you might do about reducing those barriers. Okay, so one barrier that is and these aren't necessarily in order, I'm just putting them up there, but one barrier is an inattention during conversation. So this is what we might call multitasking, and this is where what we do is we tap out an email while we're listening to someone at the door, and and the justification is that I can get 2 things done at once. Well, first of all, our brain isn't wired that way, and I'm sure you are starting to realize that you can't actually do justice to 2 things at the same time. Brain doesn't work that way. So not only is the email substandard, but the person at the door doesn't feel that they're being listened to either, and I'm sure that conversation isn't going to be as optimal either. So what should happen in those circumstances? Well, obviously, if the email is critically important, then you need to say to the other person, look, I just need to finish this email. As soon as I've finished it, I'll come over and I'll have a discussion and have a chat to you about whatever it is you want to talk about. Or if you can see the person at the door is quite distressed, you might just close your laptop or turn away from your computer screen and give them 100% undivided attention. The great management consultant Warren Bennis said, that the biggest challenge of the 21st century was the management of distraction. I think he was absolutely right. It's not about what we need to do anymore. It's about how do we get rid of all the distractions that get in the way of what we need to do. And so what I would say to you is one of the foundation points I'd make in the Lunch and Learn series is this. If it's worth having a conversation, it's worth giving 100% undivided attention to that conversation. Otherwise, don't have it. Give that person your undivided attention and you'll find magic will happen. It's quite amazing because most people don't do that. And if you're one of those people who decide that you will give that person 100% undivided attention, you'll find some amazing things will occur in terms of productivity. It really will. And so that's number one. How are you in that area? Are you a multitasker? I hope not. It's not good. It's not necessary. Do one thing well and then do another thing well, not try and do two things mediocre together. That's not productivity in my book. Now, another big barrier is the restriction of information channels. We've all heard the saying, no news is good news. We've all heard the saying that you'll get told on a need-to-know basis. This is really problematic because it's working on an assumption that employees don't need to know, or employees can't be trusted with information. Now, that's a problem because that's not necessarily true. Who's to suggest that managers are more trustworthy than employees, for example? And where do we get that from? Albeit there are more employees than managers, so therefore the law of averages about whether information may leak is likely to occur in the employee group, but it's not because they're not trustworthy. So what I would say to you is this, that you need to be giving people more information at meetings. There's two types of information that people want. They want to know how they're going in their job, which is called feedback. And they also need to know what's going on with the organization and where it's traveling and what's happening. So they're the two things that people want. Now, your people assume that you know more than you do, just as you assume you know more, that your boss knows more than he or she does. But in actual fact, they're probably not really, excuse me for a moment. In fact, they're probably none the wiser. And one of the things I'd say to you is that if you don't have any information to share with your team, say, for example, you were going to investigate something and come back to them, you've got no information to share with your team, that's information. Just say to people at your meeting, I've got nothing else I can add to what I said from the last meeting. I'm still investigating that issue. By doing that, what you're actually doing is you're reassuring people that you're not holding back on information. And that's a very, very important. People need to know that you're sharing information with them. So look, I guess the rule of thumb is this. If you're not sure about whether to share information with your team members or not, then share the information with your team members. I don't doubt for a minute that there is information that shouldn't be shared, of course. There are things that are confidential. I'm not suggesting otherwise. And we all know that, but not only do you know that, the people that you lead know that as well. But there's a lot of things we don't share for no good reason. So you want people to be on the same page as you. Barrier number 3 is a lack of feedback. Now, if you're not giving feedback regularly to your team members, then that's a problem. Now, remember, there are two types of feedback. There is positive feedback and there is constructive feedback. Now, the constructive feedback is a little more challenging because people can have a tendency to get upset or defensive. But the truth of the matter is they need both. And if you're not very good at this, what I'd say to you is this afternoon, set yourself a little task and find 3 things that are going right and give 3 bits of positive feedback to those people doing it right. That's a good starting point. Now, I've got to tell you a very disturbing story. It's a little amusing as well, but I must tell you it's a true story. I was working in a local government environment here in Queensland. I will certainly not mention any names, but just understand it was a local government organisation. Now, in that organisation, there was a young lady who had just started work, and she was 21, just out of university. She'd been there for 6 months, and I had an opportunity to say hi. I said, "How have you settled in?" And she said, "I don't know." I said, "What? You don't know? Well, why don't you know?" And she said, "I've had no feedback." Now, she'd obviously got through a probation period, but nevertheless, no one has told her anything. And I said to her, "Look, would you like me to go and talk to your manager? And perhaps we can, sort of, I can suggest to them that they might give you some feedback." And she said, "Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, no, I'd really appreciate that." And so I said to her, I said, "Okay, well, I'll do that." So I went in to see the manager, knocked on the door, and here he was sitting behind his big black mahogany desk. And he saw me at the door, and he said, he stopped writing his email at that time, and he said, "Yeah, can I help you, Tim?" And I said, "Absolutely." I said, "Look, let's call her Mary." I said, "Mary started, I believe, 6 months ago, and she's had no feedback about how she's going. Do you think you could be able to give her some feedback?" And he had his glasses on. He was looking over his glasses like this at me, and he said, "Oh no, I couldn't do that." And I sat there and I thought, wow, wonder why? I mean, are they having an affair, or is there some conflict of interest I know nothing about? I was just dumbstruck about why he would say that. And anyway, of course, I asked him and I said, "Look, do you mind if I ask why?" And again, he was looking over his glasses. He said, "Oh, if I do that for Mary, I've got to do that for everybody." Wow. So I thought, there you go. I was speechless. He thought he was being fair, but fascinating stuff. So look, I'd honestly say to you, make sure that you are giving people feedback. Don't get yourself into that sort of situation. So feedback is critically important. All right. So let's hope you're doing that. Another one is a culture of not asking questions. Now, the truth of the matter is that you are probably highly technically trained. I mean, you've probably done a course of study somewhere and you've learned some skills. Now, when anyone does a course of study and they become a professional or an apprentice, or whatever it is that they do, you have been trained to answer questions, right? That's the whole purpose of learning something. So a lawyer is trained to answer questions. An accountant is trained to answer questions, right? That's the nature of what people do. Now, all of a sudden, you're in a leadership role and you're being asked to ask questions, not answer questions. So here's a little thought to ponder. Leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. I'll just repeat that. Leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. So your job is to ask questions. If you look at anybody that's a good conversationalist anywhere, you'll find one thing that they've all got in common, and that is they ask more questions than give answers. In other words, they get you talking, and that creates a dialogue, and that dialogue is a good conversation. Ironically, you walk away thinking they're more interesting than they were, than you thought they were. And I say ironic because all they've done is shown an interest in you. So what you need to do is to learn to ask more questions. And they're open-ended questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. If you do that, you're likely to develop far better conversations with people. Another problem that occurs, or a barrier, is too much formality. If you're having your conversations in your office, if you've got an office, it's not a good idea because you feel very comfortable there. So good for you. But what about the other person? It's not their territory. If you want them to open up and be open and honest and authentic with you, then I'd suggest you get out of your office and go to a neutral space, go to a meeting room, or even better still, get out of the building, go for a walk. I've got a client in Melbourne who takes a walk around Etihad Stadium. I don't think it's called Etihad Stadium anyway, but anyway, by the time they walk around the stadium, it's about 20 minutes. They can get a lot done. They get a bit of fresh air, a bit of exercise. And obviously, by the time they get back to where they started, it signals the end of the conversation, so nobody has to look at their watch. Get out of the office and go. You'll find your best conversations, incidentally, will often be out and about in coffee shops because people feel more relaxed. So just don't worry too much about the formality. It's not actually helping you. It's making it harder for you. So you might want to think about that. Now, it had to come up at some point, but let's talk about emails. Now, the average person spends about 2.5 hours a day on email, which I kind of think, wow, I mean, I wonder if I'm spending too much time. But anyway, that's the average. And now, that's not a problem. I'm not a Luddite. I'm quite up with technology, quite happy with it all and all the rest of it. But the problem is, as you could probably understand, and I alluded to earlier, is that we have a tendency to have too many conversations via email. In fact, we shouldn't have any conversations via email. Email is asynchronous, meaning that when you send somebody a message, they respond to it when they choose to, which is obviously the great uniqueness of the great capacity of email. Sometimes they don't even respond to it, as we know. So here's a problem. If you send someone a question and you want some answers, it's likely that you may not get the answers in a timely manner, or you may not get the answers at all, or they may not even understand the question that you're asking. So get out of your seat, go and talk to the person if they're on site, and if they're not, pick up the telephone. And you'll find that you'll get more done far quicker than by firing off a series of emails. The other thing I'd say to you is that if any of your team members start sending you questions via email when they could just as easily come over and have a chat to you, then talk to them about that. Because if you're trying to create a culture of conversation, which you should be in your team, then email is going to get in the way of that. Now, there's a lot of reasons that people do it. They cover their backside. They actually think it's more efficient. They have a record, all this kind of stuff. Look, at the end of the day, as I said, organizations are just a series of conversations. So just have the conversations with people. It's really, really the right thing to do. Number 7, a lack of role models. Now, look, there's nothing we can do about this in the Lunch and Learn, but if your senior leaders have meetings in secrecy and or they don't have any meetings, or they don't seem to, at least, and there's a lot of secrecy and there's a lack of transparency in the office, then it's likely to reverberate around the office. In other words, other people are going to take their cues from the senior leaders. But I would suggest to you that you should just put that aside and just take pride in you developing your own leadership capability by having these conversations on a regular basis. Number 8, and this is a biggie. Sometimes we don't talk to people because we don't want to open up a can of worms. And it's a problem. And it's a problem across all industries because we anticipate how other people might react. And this is a problem because how do we actually know that they're going to react that way? We might think we know, but how do we actually know? And it's not always the case that they may act that way. I have to tell you a fascinating story. I was working in a large orchestra in Australia, great orchestra. I won't mention its name again, but really fascinating. There were 2 people in this orchestra who sit side by side. So in an orchestra, your seating position really dictates your status. So the closer you are to the audience, the more status you have. And that what I mean by that, of course, is that you're the section leader. So the lead, your section's behind you. These two people hadn't spoken to each other for 10 years, and they sat side by side. And the only thing that separated them was a music stand. Can you believe? Unbelievable. And when I found out about this, I found this incredible. I actually said to one of them, I said, look, come on, you must be joking. Surely you've had a conversation in 10 years. And he said to me, no, we haven't spoken to each other for 10 years. I said, come on, at the end of a concert when you're in the bar celebrating, surely. No, he goes to one end of the bar, I go to the other. Okay. What about with artistic matters, during rehearsals and things? Surely. He said, no. And he pulled out a notebook out of his pocket. And he said, no, what we do is we write notes to each other and hand them to each other. Yeah, I just found that absolutely bizarre. Anyway, I found it really interesting. But I said, and what happened 10 years ago? It must have been bad, but it wasn't bad. It was just some misunderstanding. And what happened as a result of that misunderstanding is that these two people just couldn't see eye to eye. And that was a real problem. So opening up a can of worms, I don't think is a good reason not to have conversations. So don't use that as an excuse. Let people decide how they'll react, and you just get on and do what you need to do. By the way, it doesn't make things go away. You can't make things go away by not confronting them. They won't go away. They'll just manifest themselves in a different way. I'm sure you'd be aware of that. Now, there's not much you can do about this one, but at the end of the day, the office environment has a huge impact on the quality of conversations. So remember years ago, open office environments, they were the big thing. If everyone's not hidden behind a doorway, it'll encourage open communication and people will say what they need to say. Well, of course, that backfired big time, because when someone talks to someone else in an open office environment, they also know there's probably another dozen people who can overhear the conversation. So they bother not to say anything. Or what you hear is what you hear, what we might call dehydrated conversation. In other words, just chit chat. There's nothing very meaningful that happens in that. Fortunately, now workplace architects are remedying this, and we're finding offices are far better laid out in terms of that. So, folks, there's the key 9 barriers. Now, I want you to have a think about those 9 and think, well, which of those are problematic for me? And secondly, is there anything that I can do about it? And I mean, for some of these things, there may not be anything you can do about it, but for some of them, of course, there's a lot you can do about it. So I want you to have a think about how you might deal with that. And, to get the ball rolling as such. All right, so let's talk about these 5 pillars. We've got about 10 minutes to go, and I just quickly run through and whiz through these 5 pillars for you. So the 5 pillars of authentic conversation. 1 is agree on expectations. 2 is challenge unhelpful behaviour. 3 is establish a trusting relationship. 4, show genuine appreciation. And 5 is build for the future. You'll notice that the first 2 are task focused. The second 2, the other 3 are people focused. So let's go through that. Now, there's 7 questions in order to set expectations that you might like to think about. So are you clear about the expectations you have of your team? That's a good starting point. Are you absolutely clear about that? Now, people aren't mind readers. You've got to communicate that once you have them, but nevertheless, having them is a good start. Have I communicated those expectations to my team members? Now, I don't mean once in a meeting. I mean over and over again, moment by moment, project by project, situation by situation. Do your team members actually understand what your expectations are about? Sometimes they won't. Well, a lot of times they won't say to you, I don't understand. So you assume that they do when they don't. Do my team members accept those expectations? It's one thing to understand them. It's another thing to accept them. And are they committed to meeting them? Now, one of the best questions you can ask your team members is this: when you give them a job to do and you've got an expectation around that, just say, can I get your commitment on this? Now, if you say, can I get your commitment on this? You'll usually get a nod, a grunt, or a yes. Now, that's good. You want that, because by getting that, you've got some non-verbal or verbal confirmation that they're committed, and then therefore they're less likely to let you down. There's nothing at all derogatory or condescending about asking for commitment. It's actually a very reasonable thing to do. You want their commitment, so why not ask for it? Pretty simple, really. And if, of course, if they can't commit, then it's a conversation around why they can't commit. Number 6, do your team members know how they're performing against those expectations? Summed up in one word: feedback. Are you giving them regular feedback? Number 7, are you supporting your team members to achieve those expectations? And that is moving roadblocks, organizational barriers, and so forth that get in the way from achieving that. So that's important. So you can see that it's quite complex, but you need to manage your expectations. Number 2 on the list, you need to challenge unhelpful behavior, right? What are the consequences of not challenging unhelpful behavior? Well, one of them is that it's not going to go away, right? In fact, in many respects, if you don't challenge it, it's considered to be appropriate or certainly not problematic. So you need to challenge behavior. And of course, I'll help you with that as we go through the process in our weeks and months together. Pillar number 3, you need to establish trusting relationships. Now, I would say that to do that, you need to do some things. You need to treat people fairly, even if you don't like them, because at the end of the day, you need to treat them fairly. So try and separate your interest, your like in them to, fairness. Treat them fairly. Be scrupulous in terms of treating people fairly. Recognize their positive contributions. And the best way to do that is just to say thank you. Thank you for staying back for the extra couple of hours to complete the project. Thanks for speaking up in the meeting this morning. Thank you for dealing with that irate customer the way you have. So give people clear direction. And that comes from expectations. Like I said earlier, that gives people confidence. That gives them psychological safety. Support their development, help them grow and develop in role. So if you do those things, you will build a more trusting relationship. It may not ever get to where you want it to be, because remember, it takes 2 to tango. The other person's got to have some trust in you as well. And sometimes their trust threshold can be very low, or high for that matter. So you need to work that out. Number 4, you need to show genuine appreciation. And as I said earlier, thank you is the best way of doing that. So just get good at doing that. No one's ever going to say to you, look, please stop saying thank you. They won't say that. So don't worry about it. But if you say thank you, it's the ultimate form of empathy, because by saying thank you to someone, you're demonstrating that 1, you've noticed, and 2, you appreciate. It's not a bad place to start. So think about how you might do that. I think that's extremely important. And build for the future. What's that all about? Just remember that every conversation that you have with people is about setting up a better future. You can talk about the past, you can talk about incidents, you can talk about blame, you can talk about all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, as a leader, you've got to turn the conversation onto the future and what's going to happen. So what you want to do is you want to reinforce the good things that people are doing so that they continue to do it in the future. And you want to get people to change their behavior so that they do things different in the future. And that's really, really important. All right, so that's it, folks. And the simple homework I've got for you is I just want you for 2 weeks to find one opportunity every day to say thank you, and just say thank you. you'll be amazed at the difference it'll make. You really will. I mean, you might think, well, oh, that couldn't make all that much difference. I can guarantee to you it'll make a lot of difference. So give it a shot, and you'll be quite surprised at how incredibly useful that is. Now, folks, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? You're very quiet in our first session together. That's quite normal. And anyway, I probably haven't shut up enough to give you a chance to ask a question. But is there anything that's on your mind that you might want to ask at this stage? Okay. All right. Well, I hope you're still there. It looks like you are. All right. So so your homework is to do that, and keep your eyes peeled for the recording and the slides. And just remember this: sometimes they go into people's junk mail, so just check that sometimes. But you'll get one after every session, and it'll give you the as I said, the slides and the recording. So, and don't forget, of course, to register for the next session as well, because that's your opportunity to do that. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend. And don't forget to start saying thank you. And you'll be surprised at the difference it'll make. And maybe you probably thought, oh, goodness, I thought I would learn something of some substance here, and he's asking me to say thank you. No, it's a good thing to do. I can assure you it'll make a big difference. So see you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll catch up in 2 weeks. Thank you and goodbye.